Well, they're working, so we're not sitting there too much. Anyway, it's a hobby, mostly focusing on fossils, but if you're in Florida and you're into fossils, you're going to overlap some with archaeology and artifacts and stuff. And the key is to be responsible about both fields, and we're going to get into a little bit of that, but we're going to focus mostly today on Chapter 7 of my book. When I came out with the book, I wanted to learn more. Most people in the fossils, they want to know, what is it? How old is it? That was mostly what people, most of your fossil collectors want to know, what did I find? How old is it? And then past that, they don't go too far. I wanted to go further. I want to know, okay, why does it have this nook and cranny? Why is it shaped this way? I just wanted to get deeper into it. My original vision was, the original 6 chapters of the book pretty much came out as I envisioned them, and Chapter 7 was going to be this chapter on cultural modification. And as I started going into it, it really could have been a book unto itself. It ended up with more plates and pictures than any of the other chapters, and I probably still haven't scratched the surface on it. So we're going to get a little introduction on stuff. The cultural modification of bones, antlers, and teeth by Paleoindians and Native Americans, like I said, could have been a book unto itself. A rule of thumb for people collecting fossils is they use that 10,000 year mark as kind of a limit for what's considered a fossil and what's not. And when it's younger than that, it's kind of a sub-fossil. However, we know scientifically some things could be buried 6,000, 7,000 years and be completely fossilized, mineralized, or whatever. They know that there's a place out called the Mammoth Site out in South Dakota, and it's several 100,000 years old, and all the bone is still original bone because of the anaerobic conditions. So it's not really fossilized at all. So that 10,000 year mark is kind of the end, at the time when they came out, the rule of thumb, the end of the Pleistocene, or where they thought the Pleistocene was ending when people first came out with that rule of thumb. And that keeps changing when the first non-Americans or whatever came across the land bridge, or however they got here, pushing it back. So the items that we're going to be represented here would be considered, many of them would be considered subfossil. However, they could or should still represent culturally what would exist during the Paleoindian period. Now, I'll point out which ones are absolutely. When you see modified llama or camel bones, modified horse, that type of stuff, mammoth, mastodon, we know it's going to be from Paleoindian period because that's how old they are. But there's animals that existed in the Pleistocene, like the white-tailed deer, Odiocoileus virginiensis, the same in the Pleistocene as it is now. So you can't differentiate those bones. So if that's a modified bone, maybe it's archaic, maybe it's early archaic, maybe it's Paleo-Indian. So it's hard to tell with some of that stuff. The most common finds in the early archaeological record in North America are modified stone implements. People find points, what some people call arrowheads or whatever, various stone implements, just because they don't even have to preserve, they're already stone. Items made from bone, antlers, and teeth provide us with a further look into how these early peoples made a living. Items made of shell were also items that could go back to the Paleoindian times. In really rare instances, plant remains, wood, other biological materials have been found in totally anaerobic deposits. Not too many of those are going to date still to the Paleoindian times. And in later centuries or later cultures, items made of ceramics, metals also added to our knowledge. And you have to understand, if you're going to represent an entire culture, the Noonan culture or whatever culture, just by their points, that's a really narrow, that would be like describing our culture just by spoons. It's so narrow. There's so much more. There's so many things made out of wood, leather, all kinds of stuff that we have no idea what they did because it just didn't preserve, other than in really rare instances in those anaerobic conditions. Now, when I got into this, I'm going to talk about the professional versus the amateur. Professional archaeologists are people that work at the universities, museums, people like Bob Austin, people that did it for a living, got their degree in it or whatever. And then there's amateur people, which many of you people might be because you're interested. Maybe you go on a dig with a professionalist and that's accepted. And most people, that also holds true somewhat for paleontology or people working with fossils. What people don't want to, and I'm not going to, this could be a lecture all unto itself, there's actually a third group called commercial people. And it's the commercial people, this is just my little quick diatribe, are the ones that really are screwing things up because they're buying and selling and they're trying to, if you see an amateur person who's doing it for the love of it, and you find out he found something, he sold it, it's because some commercial guy goes, oh, that's worth all this money, you need to sell that instead of donate it or tell somebody else about the site. But there's also another thing that goes with the amateur and the professional, and we're going to get into that in a second. Conservative versus speculative. In the 1960s, Lou Binford became a founding member of what became known as the New Archaeologists. Amongst other things, Binford became highly critical of what were and were not culturally modified items. From that point onward, a high majority of professionals became highly conservative on what items they would attribute to being worked by humans and what could occur through natural processes, especially when we're talking about bones, antler, and teeth. If you see a stone point, a scraper, it's pretty obvious for the most part that it's been worked or modified. But you could look at some, and we're going to show some examples here of bones, antler, and teeth, and you're going, okay. And Binford came out and said, wait a minute. And he did what we would call one of the first people to do experimental archaeology. And he went up with the Inuits and this and that, and he went and looked at what those native cultures were doing and saying, well, when they get done eating this piece of meat or with this bone, they throw it to the dogs, and this is what the dogs did to it. And then after they moved their camp, and then this is what other scavengers did. And then he came out and said, okay, look, here's the same one that was just reported in National Geographic as something that was split open for marrow, and it looks exactly like stuff that was occurred through natural processes. So at that point, he discredited a lot of people. Quite a few professional archaeologists were discredited on things that they had claimed because he proved that they could have occurred some other way. And the whole field became, in my mind, and a lot of people's mind, a lot more conservative on what they would speculate about. Because if you speculated and you speculated wrong, and you were proved wrong, and you published on it and you were wrong, your career could be ruined. And there's something to be said positive about being conservative also, because there was all kinds of, the killer ape theories and that kind of stuff that came out in the 60s by, I'm trying to think of the guy who wrote The Naked Ape and all their stuff. It turned out that none of that stuff was correct. So they were just doing these wild speculations. So anyway, Binford's highly conservative approach would eventually ruin some professional careers, as both his approach and his methods discredited many early assumptions of what was worked and what was not. However, in the aftermath, many feel his approach went too far. As an amateur, I'm not confined to this. So in my book, what I did was try to present, okay, and I'm going to show some examples of this is stuff that the professionals say, this is stuff that the amateurs say, and these are some things that it could be either thing we're really not sure. As a professional, they would never present even the really not sure one. We're not going to speculate that it could be this because I'm not going to go there and publish on that. Then I might in a talk or something. So when I first started working on this chapter, Jim Dunbar up in, I guess he's in Tallahassee at the time, right? Yeah, and he helped me out with something. He's the one who turned me on to Lou Binford, but he also gave me another tips about a guy named Robson Benichson or something. Anyway, he had another book. They were saying the opposite things of each other. We're going to get to one of those items that they were, and I'm thinking, okay, well, if he's saying it absolutely can't be this, but this guy's saying, well, no, it absolutely can be this, I don't have to adhere to both. In my book, I can present both sides and let you decide what you think it is. And that's where I went. And before I go any further, I got to point out that Bob Austin was good enough to actually review this chapter for me and set me straight on a lot of stuff, as was Herman Trapman, Paul Lynn. So I had a lot of help from a lot of people. And when I first started working on the book, and I sent it to the University Press of Florida, they came back with a review, and the person said, they gave it to a paleontologist at UF. She's no longer there. I think she's at City College in New York or something, Penny Lynn Higgins. And she wrote this comment on that, well, he really knows his archaeology, but his paleontology needs to be tweaked, because I'm sending it to professionals to get reviewed. And I'm thinking, well, I thought I knew a whole lot more about paleontology and archaeology, so I need to get an archaeologist to look at this thing. And then when Bob Austin looked at it, it was like, well, he seems to really know his paleontology, but his archaeology is, they were saying, so it kind of gave me the idea that there wasn't a lot of overlap sometimes between the two groups, because people really tend to specialize now. But in Florida, there is overlap, especially when you get in the rivers and some of these sites where, as you're going down through layers. So what's modified, not modified? Here's a typical example. This is something I found on the Peace River, and it is a dolphin vertebrae. It's probably from the Miocene. So this is kind of a really special case, because if it's from the Miocene, it's 5 to 24 million years old. Well, there weren't people around 5 million years ago. But it's obviously had a hole drilled through it. It was probably used as a net weight. at the bottom of a long net to send across a river. And so that's what that is. So there are some examples of things with holes in them that are made by either worms or crustaceans, and they're not so absolutely perfect. And so we're going to look at some stuff. The first thing we're going to look at when we talk about cultural modification, unintentional modifications. Things that could still be considered culturally modified: butchering, other unintentional modifications, marrow extraction, byproducts of tool making. So these are items that we find, and we're going to attribute the marks on the bones, teeth, or antler to humans, to culturally modified, but it was a byproduct, it wasn't their real intention. And again, like anything else, I'm trying to make sure I get the right thing. This is a piece of bone I found in a Peace River. We can look at these marks, and they're pretty arbitrary, and they're on the large of what the surface of the bone they're on. According to Binford, this is not where somebody would cut on a typical bone to remove meat. You would cut near the joints to try to get the tendons to strip the meat off. So this is on the, so these are probably some type of carnivore, and if you're thinking about it, probably a dire wolf, if I had to guess. So that's not very clear. This one here is a camel. I want to say it's part of a tibia. It might be a radius. I can't remember. I have to look in the book. And it's got all kinds of marks on it where they would have trying to hack on the bone to scrape that and pull that meat off. So it's obviously been modified, culturally modified, but not intentionally. This wasn't meant to be the end product. The end product they ate. So, and this one came from University of Florida, and it's got some very distinct, it's not a great picture. The picture in the book is pretty clear. Cultural modification where they were butchering this bone to strip the meat off of it. Marrow extraction. One of the first 3 or 4 people to dive in Florida was Al Welbury. He did it with Ben Waller, Joel Malwin, and Colonel Sanders, Colonel Royal. Colonel Royal. And, but Al was old school, and when I got to see him, it was only maybe about 6 months before he passed, and he was really gracious, but he was the old school. Everything was culturally modified. So he was convinced that these were bones that were all modified for marrow extraction because they were cracked, and yet that's one out of his collection, and I want to say this one, but I had scores of these bones in the bottom of the Peace River. They're just the way the bones break when they're, I would think if it was marrow extraction, it would have been, according to Binford, he would have a much longer break so they could get the marrow all out of it. You wouldn't break it just across like this. So these are just natural, what we call spiral fractures, and it's just a natural way the bone might break. This is a bone that it's cut perfectly straight. It's out of a northern river. It's an ulna from a horse, from an equus. That puts it in paleo time. This was modified, and so this was a Paleoindian. This was both a fossil and an artifact. And but it's again, this is not the end product. They were looking for long, sliver straight, maybe to make bone pins or whatever they were going to use, what they were carving that bone for. Other unintentional. This is a mammoth tooth. It's from a northern Florida river. It's out of Barbara Fite's collection. And you can see the scrape marks here. Now, if this tooth had been found up in Wisconsin or Michigan, it would have been attributed to glacial till. I mean, the tooth got caught in the glacier, and the glacier was scraping alongside the mountain. The glaciers didn't make it down to northern Florida. So we don't know if that was being where they were trying to cut it out of the jaw, or they were scraping. Who knows what was going. It could be trampling, maybe. But I have another example of trampling later on, which is far more obvious because these are just absolutely too perfectly spaced. This is a deer antler tine, which is little tips to the end of the deer antler, and you can see all this out of Mike Searle, Mike Encina's collection. You can see all these hack marks, and it's speculated that that bone was being held and something was on top of it, and they were chopping it, and they were using that almost as a backing of something. And there's no meat or anything on a deer antler; it just sticks up. So they were using this as a backing to make something. So it's a byproduct, again, unintentional. So now we're going to get to the meat of the thing. Intentional modifications, things that they did deliberately. Fishhooks related items, bone pins, and again, in the book, I mentioned the book, I couldn't find any cohesive publication on how to categorize the different categories of bones, antler, and teeth. So I made these, for lack of a better term, artificial categories. All fish hooks and related items went in one, bone pins, carved and incised items, Atlatl Components, Antler Handles, pressure flakers, Knapping Batons, tools, jewelry, and then partially worked specimens. So I made these artificial categories so I could group the thing and get it out somehow and have it make sense, at least to me. The first one we're going to talk about, fish hooks. I did a presentation here maybe 6-8 years ago on a comparison of the fishing Gulf Coast, Florida, Pacific Northwest, which is as far away as you can get from the Gulf Coast of Florida, and the Pacific Northwest was kind of a proto-historic, means just as 1600s to 1700s, compared to our archaic fishing cultures, and I compared it to the Walmart fishermen, because we all think, you see all these new fishing gizmos that come out, and you're like, they had this stuff 5,000 years ago. I mean, it was amazing, the stuff, fishing lures and hooks and, it was just nets and traps and all kinds of stuff. So this first one is a throat gorge, and it's hard to see in this picture, but there's a carving right there, straight up and down, and they would have tied a piece of meat or bait of some kind, and they would have tied it to a line that would have went out like this up to wherever they were on the shore. The fish would swallow it this way, but when they pulled on it, it would turn sideways and get caught in their throat, and that's how they would catch a fish. And that was the very first examples of types of fish hooks, so those are early. But a lot of this stuff is overlap, because if that worked for a certain type of fish, they would have used that for thousands of years, even after things like this were invented. And we can understand that this is a fish hook, and I don't think anybody would deny it. But there was a presenter here, right at this very Archaeological Society, 6-7 years ago, a presentation I came to, and she was a professional archaeologist from university, and someone asked her about fish hooks. And her very first comment out of her mouth was, well, we're not absolutely sure they're fish hooks. And I was like, whoa, but that comes from that ultra-conservative, so unless there was a bass hanging off the end of it, she wasn't going to accept that it was a fish hook. So I raised my hand and said, well, what do you think it could have been used for? And she had to stop and think, and she's like, well, maybe to fasten clothing, maybe to, and you're going, okay, you'll find them in the river, they got a knob on the end, but now you're speculating. I think it's a better speculation that this is a fish hook than that you used it to hook clothing, but that's just an example of that ultra-conservative. We're not going to, unless, maybe they found it in a dried out cave with a line and hooked to a bamboo pole, she would accept it. I don't know. But, hit the wrong thing. Here we go. So this is a rather large fish hook. That's from Paul Lynn's collection. He's here tonight. Those two small ones are only about 3/4 of an inch. I looked at the measurement on this. It's a little over 3 inches. That guy was catching some big stuff, and you can see there's a groove cut in here where they would have tied a line to it. You can see the knobs on these pretty clear. Again, at 3/4 of an inch, it's a small. They're catching small fish, and maybe, again, speculate, maybe they're catching bait fish to put on this thing to catch the bigger fish. Who knows? So, but they had all kinds of fish hooks. Now, composite fish hooks, and I'm glad Paul brought his stuff tonight. You can go back there and look at it because he has some interesting stuff. Herman Trapman made this one. Right here is a bone pin. Now, we find these little short bone pins all the time, and we presume, what are they sticking with it, or what are they doing? Well, we know that they sometimes made this as two pieces of wood that are hafted together somehow. They've stuck this pin. So this is you can see it's, 7-inch thing, and it goes to 1. So it's about a 6-inch hook. He's made his homemade twine, and this is an actual, would be catching some big fish on this. But the only thing that would have preserved if this thing fell in the river, got lost in the river 6,000 years ago is right there. That's all that you would find. All the rest of the stuff would just disintegrate and go bye-bye. And then we find these, and we go, what are these used for? Now, here's another example. That's a deer antler tine. It's got a hole drilled through it. And that's a raccoon baculum. It's a raccoon penis bone. And Paul's got 4 or 5 of them back there, baculums, and you're going, and I have found, at one time I found 3 in the rainbow, in an area going, well, how can I find 3 raccoon penis bones which are small and fragile and not any other part of the raccoon? Because they were using these, and again, most of the time they weren't used in a deer antler tine. They were inserted probably in a piece of wood, as this was. Wood disintegrates, and we find their fishing gear. All we're finding is the baculums. And they're really, you'll see they're very, very thin. He's got some whole baculums back there where they weren't quite modified. They hadn't cut them off yet or whatever. But So again, a composite hook. Here's another composite hook, typical bone pin. Another very specialized looking bone pin. They would have had some pitch or tar or something like that they would have pine tar, glued it together, and then wound it like Herman had done in the previous picture. And maybe this would have, same thing with the rope here, and another type of fish hook, a composite. Now, this is literally composite because these weren't found together. We put them together. I can't remember if Paul had these or not, and we stuck them together just as an example. Maybe Tatum. I can't remember who put those together for me. These ones here are Paul's, because I just looked at them, and these are Paul's. So typically, the bone fish hooks are very fragile, and it's much more common to find pieces than to find nice, perfect whole ones. Now, Paul's got some nice whole ones back there, but I think he's got some of these pieces. Same thing with these spear points. Now, again, if you look in today's thing, they would take the pictures of the Spanish that they drew pictures of early Indians, or I should say the later Indians fishing, and from the proto-historic period out on the west coast, there would be 3 of these sticking out of the end of a thing called Leicester spear. So when you stuck it in, and if you had all of the barbs facing outward, the fish is not going to come off. They couldn't be really used singly, because then it would go in, the cut would be as big as the thing. So anyway, however, if you read the professional literature, we don't know that they ever had Leicester spears, because they've never found 3 of them together attached to a, pole or whatever you would attach them to. Again, this is a nice one. You got a big, long deer antler tine. They've cut the barbs into it. And again, it's curved now, but it's believed, and you're going to see a picture later of some ivory that's also curved now, but was probably straightened out either in fire, boiled in water. Somehow they probably had a way of straightening that out. And Dr. Webb from University of Florida, when he was talking about the ivory, he believes that some of this stuff actually has, for lack of a better term, a memory in it. So that eventually, after thousands of years, it goes back to its natural curve. Because you're going, what good is a spear that's curved like that? If I stick on the end of a stick, it's useless. But if this thing was nice and straight, here's a deer antler tine that's been straightened out. It's still straight as an arrow. I found that one on the rainbow. And it's about here where it's hollowed out, where they would have mounted it on the end of a stick and probably used to spear. Someone said manatees. I find that hard to believe because it's just not that big. But probably large fish or something like that. Maybe a manatee. Who knows? So now we're going to go to bone pins, considered the Swiss Army knife of early Native Americans. Now, they use these bone pins for everything. And we've already seen some bone pins used in the fishing culture, part of the culture, where they were using different parts of the bone pins. Here is a nice big long one with a rounded end, so you can imagine they would have held that rounded end maybe as an awl or whatever. Here's ones that are shaved on one end. These were probably used as foreshafts. You're going to see a picture of that coming up soon. There's all kinds of bone pins. Here is a bone pin that's incised, and you're going to see other incised stuff later. So you can see the zigzag. And it's funny because Terry Soleri found this on the Withlacoochee at about the same time that Barbara Purdy published a twin of this bone in, I think it's Website Archaeology. I can't remember which book. She has many books out. But there's a perfect picture of one. And other than hers, the tip is intact, where the tip is a little bit broken off, but with the exact same shape. Believed possibly as a bone pin or a feather holder, because so it would have gone inside of another piece and then feathers would have stuck out of it. We'll show a couple of pictures of stuff where that could have occurred. So here's another type of feather holder, and here are the bone pins here, and they have an end on it, and they would have been, here's a nice piece. Now this is probably an archaic piece or maybe even a later than that, but it's pretty well preserved. Nice hole drilled through it. This pin would have stuck straight through that, and they would have stuck their hair through it, and then a pin through that, and possibly even stuck a feather in with the pin as a feather holder. So a lot of uses. Again, questions as to whether the early Native Americans had needles. If that doesn't smack of a bone needle, I don't know what it does. I don't know what else you could possibly use it for, shaped like that with a nice hole drilled in the end of it. And you can see it's probably about 6 inches long, so it's a pretty big piece. This was a curious one. Andreas Kerner found this on the Withlacoochee. And nice long bone pin, And I hope you can see in the picture from here forward, you can still see where the pitch or the resin was on it, where it was glued into a stick or a foreshaft or whatever. So that's a pretty cool piece. Right there you can see the black still stained from the pitch and tar and the rest of the bone pin. This is typical of bone pins when they were used as awls. They would be stuck inside of a deer antler handle. This one had a nice hole drilled. You've got a nice bone pin. I think this is Tatum's piece. That's not yours, is it, Paul? It's not back there. Anyway, but whoever I took the picture from, it's a credit in the book. I've got them all written down. They admitted that this was a composite, meaning they were found near each other in the river. Hey, look, it fits in there perfectly. Let's stick it in and say that's what it was used for. This one is a deer jaw, and that bone pin goes all the way back to about here, and that one, you can't even pull the bone pin out. It was found that way. So we know that this handle, deer jaw handle, with still got a couple teeth left in it, had the bone pin in it. Now, most of the ones you've seen there could be archaic, could be later, could be early archaic. This is a camel cannon bone. Now, we know they went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene. And we can tell by the size, and there's the distinctive line, all artiodactyls, deers, camels, llamas. They have a cannon bone that's shaped like this and has this very distinct ridge. But by the size of it, we know it's from the large camel. It has a bone pin that's sticking out of both ends. And trust me, you would never get if you found this and then tried to stick another bone, you would never get it through there. Anyone that's found this stuff in river knows that this is authentic. The reason it's important is it's the big camel, so it's a Hemiacania macrocephala or whatever. It's paleo. They were mounting these bone pins into larger bones to use as awls or whatever they were using it for back in paleo times. That's Pleistocene. So we know that they were doing it. So when we see the other ones, we can presume that they had smaller versions also. So these are some incised designs. A lot of these are from Brian Evanson, Tick Island stuff. Some are from other people. And you can see the clear incisors on these bone pins, very clearly done. This one's got two really perfectly carved tips on it. No real idea what that was used for. This was a unique one because it's carved exactly the same on the opposite side except a mirror image. So if you were to flip it over, the pattern would be going in the other direction, so they had to somehow figure it. This is a deer antler tine. It's been carved here, hollowed out, and a hole drilled that goes all the way through both halves of it. So who knows what they were hafting it to or what they were doing that. Tony Perez found that. I'm not sure where. It's off the top of my head. Everything's labeled in the book. This is a Tick Island piece here from Brian Evanson. Again, this is a deer cannon bone. You can tell by the shape and the slit in it. And ceremonial probably, just because I don't know why you would put all those carvings on it. And just the opposite on the opposite side. Here is a deer jaw, and it's very clear to see the incising and the parallel lines. In the book, I have a whole chapter on mimics of what rodent gnaw marks would look like, and they would not look anything like that. So that's definitely incised. So the Atlatl, for those that may or may not be familiar, it's a spear throwing device, and this is the part right, your hand would go right here about where the grip is, and then this person made a replica, and there's a feather on it. I don't know, can't remember who made this. Someone gave it to me. They were making them. Anyway, right here is a bone knock where the end of this shaft would go in it. This is a foreshaft with a point on it. So this end would get inserted in here. That end would get inserted into the knock. And the theory of, if you remember Leonardo da Vinci, give me a lever big enough and I can move the moon. So if I can make my arm longer, I can get more power out of it. And the idea, which these early Native Americans figured out, and there's some debate as to whether Paleoindians had this or not, but we know it existed in Europe almost in cave time. So it's hard to believe they wouldn't bring this over with them, this type of technology. But if I can make my arm another 2 feet longer, I'm going to get that much more leverage, that much more speed. If I'm chasing a mammoth, now this is not the right type of point for mammoth, but if I'm in paleo times and I have to carry 20 of these spears, that's bulky. They're long. Herman has some replicas, I don't know, about 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet. They're pretty long. These part of the shafts are long. But if I only had one of these, and I had, say, 20 of these in a little sack on my side, I can load up, throw this into the side of the mammoth, along with hopefully some buddies helping me. I'm not trying to take it down myself, and get that guy galloping. Now he's running. This part of the shaft falls out as the mammoth or mastodon is running away. I keep chasing him. I keep picking this piece up, reloading it, and throwing it again. So I only need multiples of this piece here. And that's what they believe was the technology on that. So this part here, sometimes made of bone, and this part here, and there's also a thing called a banner stone, sometimes that was ran on here, and it's a bone or stone piece that had a hole in it that they would put right above the hand. And when they threw it, that extra weight would give even more whip to the atlatl and increase the speed of the foreshaft coming out. So this is, I believe, a Simpson point. I'm not an expert on points. Is it Simpson? Yeah. So it's a Simpson, and then we've taken one of those from the previous picture, one of those bone pins that's flattened on one side, and you lay it right in there, and it's pointed here. So that would be hafted on there somehow, and this part would have gone into that really long shaft, and that's what they would be throwing. Now that is the size of a spear point you would use if you were chasing larger game. Now, the knock, this one is a bear tooth. It's squared off here and it's carved off here, and it's believed that this possibly could be one of the knocks, in other words, loaded at the end where the proximal end of the shaft is going to go. This is hard to see in the picture here. It's much clearer in the book. Banner stone, the atlatl handle would have went through here. When they throw it, this thing would slide up. This is the ivory foreshaft that came out of the Osceola River project. This is what I was talking about. Dr. Webb found that, well, him and the group that did the Osceola River project. And you can see this is 7 inches. I don't know why I have a 7-inch ruler, but this is about 12, 13-inch ivory. And he came out and he laid me, and he let me take a picture of it for the book, as long as I could promise him that my book wouldn't come out before their published paper on the Osceola River. I said, no, I'm just starting. And as it turned out, it was, I think, 8 years later before the book finally came out. But he, and this was like precious. I felt really honored that he let me picture this thing and handle it. And it's roughed on this side, pointy on this side. They thought maybe, and this is where it's made of ivory, so they're thinking that it was no good like this, but possibly straightened out through either heat and boiling, however they might have straightened it, and used as a foreshaft. But by the time they published it, I have to give Webb credit. He came back and said, maybe not a foreshaft. Maybe this went into the actual shaft, and this was the actual business end. That, in other words, they didn't have a point, a stone point at the end of it. This was the point itself. So he presented it as possibly both ways. So I think I talked to Herman about this, and he talked about possibly wooden handles, and they have these curved ones that they're using for weaving, and he set me straight on a lot of stuff, because a lot of times I think he called it a Eurocentric thinking, which a lot of us have. We just think like white middle class America or whatever, and I'm going to get to some of that later. And sometimes you have to free your mind or think of what other cultures are doing. And so anyway, this was an example of modified bone. And again, it's made of ivory. All the ivory I believe they found on site was mastodon. I could be wrong about that. I don't think it was mammoth stuff on the Osceola River. So either way, it's Pleistocene. It's old. Now, antler handles. This one Paul's got back there because I already looked in his case. And typically, you have these big blades, and if they're late archaic, there's still people that are convinced, no, those are arrowheads, and some of them are still shaped kind of like an arrowhead. We're 99% sure those are knife blades. There wasn't anything that big left to hunt. The horse, the camel, the mammoth, mastodon, they all went extinct. Aside from if you're now using a bow and arrow and you have a blade that's 2 inches wide and 6 inches, you would have to have an arrow shaft. You'd need a cannon to fire it. The Rock couldn't pull an arrow back, or Hercules or whatever. So more than likely they were knife blades. And so we don't always call them projectile points, we just call them points, but it's a knife blade, and this is a replica, and I think it's a deer or something carved. You can see the head and you can see the antlers, so this is a modern replica. But just to show how it would have been hafted. This one, antler handle here, this guy used that a long time. It is just worn smooth, and if you've ever seen the antler at the base, it's quite knobby. And so this guy's been well used, and then the blade part would have been hafted in here somehow. Now, we're going to look at other stuff made out of antlers, and pressure flakers are items they're using at the very final process on making a point or a scraper or whatever you're making out of stone, and they're going to touch that flaker, the tip of it, and just little miniature flakes and put those last little touches to sharpen the point. The problem is, so they're made out of deer antler tine a lot of times. This one is very smooth, rounded here, and you can see the polish here. This is a deer antler tine that's just broken, point blank. It's never been used. This one, you can see an incredible amount of polish here. Not so much here. Here's one that's they probably use this end to actually nap with, meaning tap it, and in this part is a pressure flaker. So that one's probably both ends have been used. Knapping batons, and I'm doing this backwards, would be the process before you got to the pressure flaker, and when the stone was probably already, the core was already brought down with another stone to a size that was workable, and then they would have used these knapping batons to hit it. The reason they use deer antler for all this stuff, it has different properties than bone or stone. And even today's people that make modern replicas, a lot of them are still using deer antlers to nap with and do those final processes with. This arrow wrench, these were from Tatum. They're from Nebraska. There's some really good, I think I have a description in the end notes about how they work. You can go online and these are two different ones. If this one is broken, it would have had at least 5 holes. It would have had to have a matching one with another 5 holes, and they would have had a process to heat the wood. But just because you cut a sapling down doesn't mean the shaft is perfectly straight. But we know that those shafts had to be perfectly straight to use as either arrows or as spears. So they had to have a way of getting that final last bit to get them perfectly straight, and they would have used what we call them arrow wrenches. I have no idea what they would have called them, but we would call them arrow wrenches. That would have been a single one. That's made out of a deer tibia. This is just made out of a sliver of bone. It has to be from a fairly large animal. Bow bearings. And when I was a kid, and maybe now, they talk about people, they're Boy Scouts and they got to go out in the woods and make fire and rub 2 sticks together. I doubt that Indians ever rubbed 2 sticks together. Their lives depended on fire. You had to make fire in a cold situation, a rainy, a damp situation. You had to make it quick. You had to make it successfully. The bow bearing was the way they did it. A stick would have been inserted, and you're going to see a picture coming up, and a stick would have been inserted in here that would have come down, piece of hardwood down here. On top of here, they may have had a piece of wood, some bare fat, so it would spin back and forth. And you can see here's a pair. That's what the inside cutout would look like. And let's just go to the next picture. You can see. So these are Herman Trapman's hands. And when he showed me how to make it, he brought it to my house and he set it down. And I want to say it was less than 20 seconds. We had smoke. And we did not try to burn my yard down, so we didn't bring it to flame. But it was amazing how quickly he could get it to smoke and start throwing sparks out. Now, the advantage aside from the speed of it, you have the bow bearing up here. You have this lanyard. At the very bottom, which is cut out of the picture, is probably a piece of hardwood that has a groove in it that the spark or the smoke would come out and it would push tinder. So if I had a little sack with me, I could get a stick anywhere. I could get this stick to tie. So I could break all this down into a very little package to travel with and make fire almost instantly. So they weren't rubbing 2 sticks together like they made how many millions of poor Boy Scouts try to do to earn a badge. So one of the other things the bow bearing was probably used for, aside from making fire, is to drill holes. Now, it's a great white tooth. I have a killer picture of a big meg tooth that's been drilled. I don't know how long a guy had to run the bow bearing. His muscles must have been this big to try to drill a hole even through a small shark tooth. We know from the Marco Island site that not all of these were worn as pendants or jewelry. We know that they had war clubs, that the gum line was buried to about here in the war club, and then the lanyard would lash it together. And those, if you ever look up any of the key Marco stuff, you'll see pictures, line drawings of those war clubs with all the shark teeth lined up. So initially when they were found, they were wearing them as like we do, or not me personally, but some of the fossil club geeks wear that big shark tooth, to the club meetings or whatever. But what's unique is, I guess there's going to be a picture later. I envision something a little different for drilling a hole through that, where this piece would have to be much bigger and heavier so you aren't pushing down. You're going to see a piece later that goes to that. Now, tools, fleshers. So you've killed a deer, a bison, a mammoth, I don't know, whatever, and you want to get to the hide, and you don't want your tent stinking. So you want to get all the flesh off of that piece of skin or hide, and this is a flesher. And this one is a Tatum called them protohistoric. So it's 1500 out west. So the protohistoric period, and a lot of people, some recognize it, some don't. It's a period of transition where the first Spanish hit the Caribbean. Some things are figured out by the Indians that these Spanish are doing. They start trading ideas all the way inland, and now people are using European ideas that have never even seen a European yet. So there's that small transitional period where, unfortunately, not only the ideas, disease and everything else was also spreading inland and in South America and stuff. And it's how I'm convinced that the 400 some odd conquistadors could conquer 30,000 Incas or whatever it was, with a blunderbuss or something. Anyway, this is made out of a bison. This is, I believe, was camel, and it's a flesher, but if it's camel, that means they were using it in paleo time. So they had the same principle of we need to use these to scrape the flesh off. Tools. Again, these are one of these ones that some people can speculate. I've heard people call these tattoo tools. I can't remember who had these. This is a broken one, but it's the same thing. It's an ulna. It's a deer. This one's a deer ulna. The ulna would come way down to about here if it was whole. It's been sharpened to a point, and there's a nerve hole. I can't remember if it's on this side or the other side. That may be it here. That runs down all the way to the end of the ulna. Well, if I sharpen it, somewhere in here, there's a little fine nerve hole, and if I take it to a point and I pour ink up here, and I start tattooing it, and we know when the Spanish first came, that was one of the things they documented. The Native Americans already were tattooing themselves all over the place, especially the Floridian ones. So we know they had tattoo tools. So that's what we believe that these are. Tools. These, I believe, are both pawls. This is a large piece of, for lack of a better term, marrow bone, but it's probably not the exact marrow. It's probably in closer to the cortical bone, but it's a large piece of bone, probably from, I'm guessing, a whale, possibly a mammoth, but it is extremely well fossilized, mineralized. It's like a piece of stone. They've cut this groove in it, and now you can imagine them using that to sharpen their bone pins or to grind the final part of that bone pin. How do they make those bone pins so perfectly straight and smooth? They would just run them back and forth on something like this. They probably had similar ones of these made out of stone maybe, but it'd be a lot easier to cut that groove into a fossilized bone. This is we can imagine sticking a thing through it. That's a mallet. I mean, it's hard not to, but this is big. It's a whale, probably a whale vertebrae. Nearer the tail, as they get closer to the neck, they get shorter and bigger, but the tail, they're longer and more elongated like this. If it's a whale, that means it's Miocene, because that's when those deposits would have been from those whales, and it's stone. It's a 5 to 24 million. So they worked this as a Miocene piece, and however they pecked a hole through it, probably took them forever, and then they had a hammer for probably generations. Because that thing is fossilized, mineralized. I mean, to this day, you could probably put a stick in there and use it as a hammer and not break it unless you were hitting metal or something with it. So if you were driving stakes, tent stakes or something with it. Again, the key to these is it shows that the Native Americans were actually using fossils. When they found fossils, and we can go at low tide sometimes, or when the river's low, oh, here's a horse tooth laying at the side of the river. We know that fossils, some people this year found already, we've seen a few in our club, nice meg teeth just found on the side of the river when the river's low. So if we were seeing them and finding them, we know that Paleoindians and later Indians were finding those things and using them. Nope, that's that. Okay, this is a hoe, so we know, and it's been, from Nebraska, it's been patched. It's got a couple grooves here. We know that this is either proto-historic or later, but we know it's after agriculture. So this is not something that Paleo-Indians would have been using, nor can we extrapolate this back into their time period. They're just, to our knowledge, was not agriculture as we know it, where they were hoeing the land. Now, were they harvesting nuts and berries and possibly even clearing out fields and differentially removing plants that let berry plants grow better? Maybe, but not agriculture as we know it, where they were taking seeds and planting them and hoeing nice long straight rows of corn. At least that would be a little bit of a push. Tools, various awls. This top one is made out of, we can tell by that, it's what they call a tarsus metatarsal. It's a bird bone. It's been sharpened into an awl. That is a deer cannon bone, and we could tell by the delamination on the bone there that it's probably really late, probably before the historic period, but it's not way early, but it's been carved here into. This is another deer cannon bone. That's a nerve hole that would be on the opposite side of this. This one's been cut off here and sharpened a little straighter. These are the actual, these knuckles here, if you split this to about here and made two things, these were found together. There's two of them. It's not two pictures of two sides of the same one. Tony found both of these, and they're two separate ones, and they're from a deer cannon bone also, and then they've been sharpened to make awls out of. This one, in fact, you can tell the shape is a little different, a little more streamlined, where this one's got that big kind of a hook into it a little bit. Jewelry. They took small hollow bones and made beads out of them. Not an easy process, a long process. It was way easier to make, especially later, to make beads out of clay. And I'm not sure if people are familiar, because I had heard this, and people said, well, I don't know how they would make the beads out of clay and make the hole. And it was the simple, once I heard the explanation, it was the simplest thing I'd ever heard. They would take a stick, mold the clay around it, cut it with a blade or whatever into sections so you had the beads made, whatever design, and throw the whole thing into the fire. The stick inside would burn out of the middle and everything else, and at the end they'd sift through the ashes and there'd be a handful of beads, clay beads. So these bone ones were far more time consuming to make because you had to cut through, especially these ones with the incising on them. Some more jewelry. That's a deer antler tine with a really nice, so it would hang as a pendant. These are different teeth with drilled holes, possibly pendants, possibly hooked into a war club, maybe. That may be a push for these. This is a great white. That's a great white. That's a tiger shark. And I think that's a mako. Unless it's got serrations on it, it'll be a great white also. This is soft-shelled turtle right here. It's an amulet. That's actually a hole that goes all the way through, but when I cleaned the picture up, I forgot to clean that part of the shadow out of it. And it's pretty cool. It's completely worn. It's a feather holder. Their ponytail or something would have been through here, and the feathers would have stuck in and stuck out, and it's incised. Ear spools. I was at the Fossil Club doing one of the presentations. I was talking about ear spools, and I made some comment about ear spools. So I've learned better to be more politically correct, but you'll see these younger generation that think this is some kind of new type of jewelry, and they have the big, I don't think very attractive ear spools. Just trying to look around to see if anybody. One time I said that to somebody, I got an ear. I'm like, okay, very nice. But, and this is just two sides of the same spool made out of a chunk of deer antler, and it's pretty big. I mean, they had to enlarge that lobe pretty good to get to pop that thing through there. So, and they also had, I've seen other types of ear decorations made out of bone that were almost like an L-shaped thing that would have went through and hung down. And buttons. This is historic period. And we talked about, I use this as an example because we know the Paleoindians didn't have this, but if you go back about 200,000 years into Europe and stuff and the cave ages and when modern humans evolved, now there's some overlap with Neanderthals, but I'm talking about modern humans as in us. There's no different in the shape or the formation of the brain. And if you look at some early cave art from even from 30 and 40,000 years ago, especially the good stuff at Lacoy and some of the French caves, it's unbelievable. These people were every bit as smart as us. They were just culturally different. So you had Native Americans here. Stuff gets brought over from Europe. They immediately saw that, wow, the button, that's a good thing to have. That's better than sticking a bone pin through two different holes. So they immediately started trying to create their own buttons out of bone. Partially worked specimens. So you saw a flesher before. This one still has the calcaneus, which is an ankle bone, a metatarsal. This is the cannon bone. They are just cutting that piece off. Remember the other one had the little serrations here? So this is a bison one. It was found in the same site as that complete one was. And this is a partially worked specimen. It's not going to be a flesher. They have stripped this. Again, this is probably from a horse or a camel. It's a large cannon bone. And it's cut perfectly straight. So whatever they were doing, they were probably trying to get straight slivers of bone out of it. But because of its size, we know this was processed in paleo times. So they were doing some types of thing. So we got some problematical specimens, and I put them into 4 categories: Geofacts, Manuports, Mimics, and Problematicals. And I'll talk about the difference between those. And then, oh, that's the wrong button. So geofacts are items altered solely through the forces of nature. This is a large bone, and this is what I talked about. That's trampling. So this was a large bone, and it found in a South Florida by Mark Renz on his LaBelle site, and they determined that there was a lot of trampling at that site. So you had animals dying near a creek bed, and then for generations, mammoths or mastodons coming through to drink at that creek bed or that spring, and they would step on the dead remains of other animals, and if you had a shell layer on the bottom or whatever, and you pushed that bone hard by stepping on it, you would end up with all these parallel scrape marks. If it's rodent gnawing, which I did not put any pictures in the slideshow, they're in the book very clearly, there's 5 or 6 examples of that, you would have had very close double parallel mark, another close double parallel, where the rodent incisors where they were gnawing on it. It's very clear to differentiate between trampling, once you know what you're looking for, and the rodent gnawing marks. But those are geofacts. They are altered solely through the forces of nature. Manuports are natural objects carried or transported by humans away from their original site. So, if I find this meg tooth way up in the mountains of Tennessee, we know that somebody traded it up there and it got carried by humans away from where it would naturally be found. And megs are found all over the world, but the geological site has to be the correct layer, the correct formation has to be Miocene. So if you're finding this in some other site, or in a archaeological site with later stuff, that means somebody carried it there because they saw it was shiny, they found it at the bottom of the river. Hey, this is a cool thing to have. Stuck it in their equivalent of a sack or satchel, whatever they're carrying it with. These are fossilized pieces of wood from Santa Fe, so it comes from a very specific area, but if I find it in another area where somebody carried it, shells are probably some of the most common Manuports you'll find. They find shells from the Gulf all the way up in those Mississippian and those mounds way up in Ohio. They'll find shells from the Gulf of Mexico and stuff. So we know they were carried and traded and used by the various cultures. So those are what Manuports are. Again, nobody's modified this. No one's done anything to it. It's just carried somewhere else from where it originally came from. Problematical specimens. This one here is one. I think both of these are Paul's. This is a mammoth vertebrae, and it's the centrum, which is the big part of the vertebrae. It's unfortunately, I put it this way, it's upside down. That's a vertebral spike, which would have come here, so it should be, the round part should be on the bottom. But somebody has spent a lot of time carving this thing out perfectly. Now, when Paul showed me this piece, his speculation was, and I don't know anything better, possibly filled with bear fat or grease or something and a wick put in it. And we know that they have found similar type items in caves in France and in Europe with wicks that are still intact, because they'll find these caves with the art and stuff, and every so often they'll find something similar, maybe not made out of bone. So that's a good speculation of why you would carve that in there, but it's still problematical. We really don't know for sure. This is the vertebral spike, which is the spike that comes off the back of the centrum, and this would be the neural canal where the nerve would go through. This one has been polished and ground, I guess would be the right word, completely flat. And I found 7 complete mammoth vertebrae this year on the Peace River, and they're shaped like this, but none of them have, they're quite, this would be a groove in here. It would kind of come around like this. It wouldn't look, they would never be ground like this. And I'm like, I can't imagine anything that would naturally grind it like that. Somebody had that on a stone, they were grinding it flat for some purpose. I talked earlier about the bow bearing. This is a piece I found. It's a carpal bone, which is a foot bone in the wrist or in the foot of a mammoth. Now, it could be a mastodon, but everything from that site was mammoth. It was on the Peace River. And when I first found it about 25 years ago, I was really new, and I had kind of clueless. I kind of had some idea, relatively smart person, and I knew it was a carpal bone. And I label and catalog everything I have. I'm compulsive about it. And someone said, well, it ruins the way it looks. And someone else said, well, just label the side you don't display. So, okay. So when I found this, I knew it was a carpal bone, but it had this ugly hole in the middle. And I had no clue about cultural modification. So I put the label on this side, and it sat on my shelf upside down as a carpal bone. Tony Estevez came over for a board meeting for the Fossil Club one time, and he picked it out. Oh, that's a cool carpal bone. He turned it over and goes, oh, check it out. Someone has carved a hole. This is really cool. And I'm like, okay. So now the label is on the side. I never changed the label because it's there. My speculation on this one is, if I was drilling a hole in an object, I wouldn't want a little piece of deer antler to push down on. I would want a nice big honking mammoth carpal bone. And this is, it's hard to see in this picture. It's perfectly carved, perfectly round. You can imagine a stick would fit perfectly in there. And you can see it's kind of beveled because you can imagine they would take the stick. It would have a stone implement at the end that they're going to drill with, whether they're drilling through wood or another tooth or whatever. And they would take that carpal bone and slam it on top. And through multiple slammings of years of use, eventually it would be kind of beveled. And if I had that on top and I used my thing, now all of a sudden I'm not having to push the whole time. I'm getting some weight out of that big bone to help push down. And again, pure speculation on my part, but I can't imagine what else it could have been used for. Now, Herman Trapman set me straight on this one. Now, these are all natural bite marks on. Those are 2 deer toes, first and second digit, and that's a camel toe bone. So you can see, similar to both artiodactyls, pairs of toes on the bottom after the cannon bone. So you can see bite marks. That's oblong, could be some kind of small cat, like a bobcat or something. That's a little bit more round, it could be a gator bite mark. But some of them have absolutely perfect holes drilled in them. They're perfectly round and beveled. And you'll see them, that was where Robson Benichson wrote, said, these are deer toe whistles. Okay, cool. And then I read Binford stuff, and he goes, absolutely not. That's a bunch of hooey. So I said, you know what? I know mine are not drilled, but they got a good hole in them. I'm going to see what kind of sound they make. So I held them up, and I blew them, and they went like this. And maybe not even that loud. And I'm thinking, so when I first wrote the book, before I showed it to Herman, I said, you know what? I'm leaning with Lou Binford. These are not deer toe whistles. Nobody could hear them. How am I going to get in touch with somebody at the other end of the woods with this whistle as in a hunting party? Not very useful. And when I showed it to Herman, Herman said, well, you know, in South America today, some of these indigenous cultures, they're out there hunting llama or alpaca or whatever they're hunting, and they might have one of these on their little necklace, and if they make a good kill, they're going to hold that little llama toe up to their thing, and they're going to pray to the llama gods and go, so no one has to hear it but you and the llama god, or you and the hunting god. So now all of a sudden it made sense that if those ones that had those perfectly drilled holes, it doesn't go all the way through, and they make a little better whistle than what I'm doing, but not much. Well, that would make sense. I'm not trying to make a sound to attract someone else. I have a few things not pictured here in the book. One has an Atlatl handle, and it's got straight parallel lines on it that are very deeply grooved, that if you take a stick and rub it on it, it sounds like a woodpecker. Now that makes sense if in a hunting party, because I don't want to make an artificial sound that's going to scare the animals. I want something that they're going to say, oh, that's a woodpecker somewhere pecking away. And so deer toe whistle, if I'm going to make a loud whistle, if I'm any kind of animal, any kind of intelligence, I'm thinking, okay, there's humans in the area, I'm getting out of here. So, but if I'm just trying to make it sound between me and the deer god or the hunting god or whatever, it makes sense that you would have these deer toe whistles or possible whistles made out of this stuff. This is a major problematical, and you probably can't see what's going on, but I'll explain it. Right here is an archaic stemmed point. Perfect one. These are the occipital condyles. That's the back of a bison skull where it joins to the atlas, the first vertebrae. This here is what they call a foramen magnum, which means large, all it means is large hole. But it's where your nerves come out of the back of your brain to go down your spine. Now, our hole is on the bottom of our skull because we're standing upright. But all other animals, the hole is in the back of the skull because their backbone goes straight back. So that's the back of a bison antiquus skull. And there's a perfect point in it, archaic point. So this is probably at least 9,000 years old. Now, University of Florida has a bison skull with the tip of a point, and it's been published in about 4,000 different items, and it's been on everybody's slideshow, and it is not 1/1000th as good as this specimen here. It's broken off right at the thing here, so all you see is like an oblong thing where there's supposed to be a stone point going in. You can tell it's in there, and they've tried to x-ray it and this and that, and what we call these is a smoking gun. What we want to know is that how are we absolutely sure that Clovis people hunted mammoths? Well, when they found them inside the ribs things with the cut marks or whatever else in Clovis, New Mexico, they started attributing, and in the Folsom points with the bison. So here is unequivocal evidence of a archaic stemmed point in the back of a bison antiquus skull. So why is it problematical? Well, and if you look in my book, it says, I can't remember how I wrote them, anonymous collection or whatever. So somebody let me photograph this. They found it. They were immediately offered, I think, $25,000 for it on the river. They didn't sell it. They still have it to this day. It's never gotten to really the people that need to study it, which would be professionals. It came out of a site that I found. If I had found it, it would have 20 years ago. It would have went to UF, and I don't know if it would have ended up in Tallahassee or if it would end up at Florida. But so it becomes a problematical because the person's going like, that's a lot of money just to give, and just now I'm going to get a literally, you don't get a certificate from University of Florida. You get a piece of paper typed up saying you've donated such and such an item. It's not frameable or anything. It's just saying thank you for donating this. They don't buy anything. They don't have a budget for it, and they don't want to cross that line of doing that, and I can understand it. So this became problematical because this is a killer piece. It deserved to be studied. It deserves to be in a museum. One of the comments that came out about it was, well, it'll just end up in a drawer. Okay, so you're hiding in your house in a drawer for 20 years, and what's the difference? And more people might have visited it in a drawer at UF than would have ever visited a drawer in this person's house. So problematical on that. Again, it was an advantage I had as a non-professional because I was non-threatening. Nobody thought I was going to report them to whoever. And so I got to picture a lot of collections and stuff that other professionals might not have had a whack at. So, in summary, you can buy the book. I got some up here for $30. They're regular $40, they're regular $39.95. It's got 7 chapters. There's chapters explaining all kinds of things. The chapter 4 is also very relevant because it talks about natural alterations. So if you don't know what naturally happens, which is the field of taphonomy, what naturally happens when an animal dies, and what kind of marks and grooves and trampling and mimics and wormholes, you've got to rule out all that stuff before you can start ruling in cultural modification, because there's a lot of stuff that looks like cultural modification. So chapter 4 would also be very relevant for archaeologists. The rest of the book is relevant because archaeological sites find a lot of bone, whether it's fossilized or not. They're finding deer and processed stuff and that kind of stuff. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions. I think I'm done with the little pointer thingy. Does anyone have any questions? Wow, I guess I covered that perfect. So Yes?
Have you ever found a manatee bone that's been worked?
He's asked if I ever found a manatee bone that's been worked. I have not, and I've not seen too many worked manatee bones. I'm sure there must be some somewhere, but I have not found or personally seen any worked manatee bones, and I've not seen any unintentional modification, like butchered manatee bones either. I haven't seen that either. So they're saying they were in the springs and they had to be there in the winter, and if it was cold like it is now up in northern Florida, and the manatees are hanging out there, and I'm hungry, I can't imagine them not spearing these things and processing them, but I have not heard too much about processed manatee. Somebody else had a question up in here. No? Yes?
Have you had a chance to look at the mammoth carving that Barbara Purdy has published on, or
Yeah.
have you seen the original? Or
I have not seen the original. I've seen it in yeah.
Yeah. So what's your opinion on the authenticity of that?
It's so hard, and there's one, and Bob and I have talked about, there's one that's also in my book that's a carved piece. It's an Atlatl handle, and it's the one that has the straight lines on one side where they're thinking they use that to talk to each other, and or they're possibly, somebody said, they could be kill tally marks for every time they killed something. They put a groove on it, but they're really deep. But it has a mammoth with a kind of a hunter guy, and it's very symbolic looking on the one that I have pictured here, to the point where I had to put a line drawing next to it so you could kind of interpret it. That one is a little more, it jumps out, I don't want to say jumps out at you, but you see it's, okay, this is a mammoth and whatever. When you see the prehistoric cave art, there's no limit to what people will do to make fake things, from making big Clovis points and feeding them to their dogs so they'll get the pitting in them, and burying them in a, oh yeah, it's unbelievable the amount of stuff. So people will do anything to make fakes. So it's hard to say that. Do I absolutely believe that there were artists that were that good and people that could carve at that level? When you look at some of that stuff from France and Italy and Spain, 40,000 years ago, unbelievable. And the carvings in ivory, so absolutely possible. I don't know how they would authenticate. It's hard to authenticate stuff, especially if stuff's found a long time ago and people threw coats of varnish on it, and how they treated it to preserve it. So there's all kinds of crazy things that happened when stuff was found 50, 75, 100 years ago, or whenever that was found. And so until something more recent is found that dates to that time period, that kind of confirms it. Now you have a second one or a third one. Really, really hard to say in my mind. I kind of hold. You always hold the hope that it's real, that it's a real thing, and that they but could they do it? I think absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Some of the most commonly worked fossil pieces you find?
The most commonly worked items, deer. You find more worked deer things than anything else, and I think there were probably, I don't say there was more deer. There's more deer in archaic and early, late, middle archaic, all the way up to now. You have so many deer, and deer goes all the way back into the paleo times. When you look at the paleo times, the animals, you have horse, camel, saber cats, dire wolves, you have all kinds of crazy stuff. But the deer survive into up till today, and probably easier to hunt, easier to catch, easier to work, the right size. When you start taking, especially if you're looking at mammoth or mastodon, you're looking at huge bones to have to process to make something out of. So, but the deer items are the most common. The deer antler handles are fairly common. I have a couple of those that I've found. Bone pins are probably the most common thing that anyone finds, but they're usually broken. Paul's got a bunch of whole ones back there, but I think he's got some broken ones too. It's really common to find broken ones, and because if you've seen some of them are pointy at both ends, some are round at one end and pointy, but once it's broken, you don't know what the other end was. It could be another pointy end, it could have been a flat end, it could have been a needle, it could have been anything. But those bone pins are probably the most common bone artifact that someone might find in a river. And again, one of the speculations, in the beginning they had no clue what they were for, and I'm talking about when the people first started finding them 100 years ago. And then people started looking at the Spanish drawings. The Spanish were pretty good chroniclers of stuff. They would come in, find a new land, they would bring people with them, whether they were monks or religious people, and they would draw pictures. And of course, the Native Americans would look like Europeans, but the tattoos, and it turns out that the bone implements and the stuff that they drew them using was very accurate. So initially, all that stuff was thrown out. Well, then all of a sudden they saw that, and when I tell my kids, I said, if you lived 100 years ago, 150 years ago, Florida was a hot place. You didn't have a barbershop. So you didn't male or female, you had a whole bunch of hair hanging down. You piled it up on your head and you stuck bone pins through it. And these were not dirty people. These we know were incredibly healthy because they didn't have any of the diseases and stuff the Europeans brought over them. They went down to the river and cleaned their hair and washed their hair, and they probably lost. That's probably one of the reasons why there's a lot of bone pins in the rivers that are found. Again, speculation, no way to corroborate that, but take it for what it is. Yes?
Did they make anything out of turtles or?
Well, you saw the one big amulet made out of turtle shell.
But the shells?
I have, well, yeah, you know, maybe they made bowls out of them, hard to say. We know that in the warm mineral springs where they had the big carapace with the hole drilled through it. It's kind of a sad story, but we know that and that's got to be paleo because it's the big geochalone, so it's this big, huge, giant land tortoise. So you got meat there for your family for a month, but guess what? It's good fishing season right now. I don't need that turtle. But he came into our camp. I'm going to drill a hole through a part of the carapace and tie him to a tree and leave him there. And then let him sit there for 3 or 4 months, and then when I need him, I'll harvest him and feed him. And so they've found those carapace with holes literally drilled through them where they had in I think in Warm Mill Springs, it was a cord or something still with it because it was anaerobic or whatever, but the steak or whatever, so they know that's what they were doing with them. So, and turtle shell is also, it's the most common thing in the fossil record, even more than shark teeth or horse teeth, not more common than shells. Regular seashells, Florida's just, the whole state is built on them. But turtle shell was used a lot. I have one very round, perfectly round, small. It doesn't have a hole or anything. It looks, Paul thought maybe a gaming piece. We don't really know, but it's made out of turtle shell, and it's completely flat, round, like almost like a poker chip.
Rattles too.
Rattles, yeah. So there was a lot of uses.
I know that there was a piece of turtle shell found in, I think, Key Marco that was used as a net gauge.
Oh yes, and that's in the book. I have net gauges made out of turtle shell.
Also,
So they would take the side, and there's a part of the carapace that comes straight down on a curve like that, and if you cut it out exactly and make a little groove in it, it becomes what they call a net gauge. So when they wrap the cord around it, every hole in the net is the same size. So when they make it and tie it, I'm not a net maker, so I don't know exactly how that works, but I know they make them out of wood, and I know my dad's father used to make nets, my nonno, in Italy, and they had some kind of net gauge they used to make all the holes uniform. So it's something that goes way back, but we're all made out of turtle shell, or a lot were, and some out of seashell.
the round world one, and I'm a fiber artist myself.
Uh-huh.
I have to speak up for women. And I really believe the round whorl could have been used for spinning, as a spinning whorl, by putting a stick through.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Spin. And also a lot of the bone pins can be used as pickup sticks for weaving, because we know they wove here.
Right, which is what I was talking about, the ivory one that yeah.
Yeah, so I think
So.
there's a lot of other uses.
Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned that deer antlers have slightly different properties than
Yes.
bone and other fossils. Can you elaborate on that?
I am not the person to elaborate on the chemical properties of bone, antler, and teeth. I can tell you that teeth are the hardest things of any animals, mammals, sharks, or whatever. So there are tons more of teeth in the fossil record and the archaeological record than anything else. It's the hardest part of our body also. The next thing is bone, and an antler is a little more fibrous than bone, so it has a little more elasticity. Other than that little more elasticity, I couldn't really tell you why it is so much better at working, but I know the Native Americans, either through trial or error or whatever, they figured it out, and that's what they used.
Well, I can add personal experience to that because we have a dog, and I know it sounds really strange, but our dog, she would chew through everything. Even we'd have her full femur from a cow. She would chew through like nothing. We get her a little deer antler, this big, indestructible. Not a scratch on it, nothing.
So different qualities.
One thing that I know from people who were doing lithic use-wear analysis, trying to figure out how they would carve. Now, this is not fossil, but regular deer antler. Soaking it in water softens it up and allows them to, cut out the center part so it could be used for hafting or to carve the outside of it. And so that might be one way that they were able to carve, because it's really hard. It's
Yeah,
really hard material.
and when you get enough people and enough time, there's no limits to what they can figure out how to do it. Because you just say, I always think of that South American tribe that they take some poisonous root out of some plant, and it goes through like a 15-step process before it's not poisonous. Like, how many people had to die before they figured this one out? Come on, they make bread out of it or something. But they figured it out eventually. So, any other questions? No. Oh.